They are telling me that we need to start. So I guess we will exchange greetings perhaps later on. My name is Steve Crump. I'm a reporter at WBTV and sometime part-time alleged, since we have lawyers in this room, the words alleged and allegedly, documentary filmmaker. And tonight what you're going to see is a piece that we actually started on back in 2017 as it relates to the legacy and contributions of Julius L. Chambers as it relates to the amazing work and the amazing life that he led here in Charlotte. To use a line from my wife, which is, you know you're going to get in trouble. So on the front end, which means, and there's going to be some dialogue and discussion once the piece runs, it's about 26 and a half minutes. But I just want to thank a lot of you here for coming out tonight. It's great to see not just the folks that worked in the law firm started by Julius Chambers, which includes Geraldine Sumter, my good friend Congressman Mel Watt, but we even have former Charlotte Mayor Richard Vinroot here tonight. So it's always good when we have just such a cross-section of representatives from the community, and I'm sure that's something that Julius would have wanted. On a personal note, and then we'll roll the tape. So, you know, I was thinking about, I guess, what's happened in my own life in the last 3 years, 7 months, and 7 days. There were 5 words that pretty much changed my life back. As I like to say, tonight's winning lottery numbers will not be 72118, but it was 5 words that changed my life when the doctors at Atrium said, "Mr. Crump, you have cancer." And that was in the middle of doing this project. And as a matter of fact, we finished a project just a couple of months ago on another well-known jurist in the state, the incredible Henry Fry. One of the sponsors of that particular broadcast was T. Michael Todd. Mike, where are you? Judge Todd, where are you? There he is right there. But in any event, I am here solely by God's grace and mercy from the standpoint of the morning after I was diagnosed on 7/22/18, there was a doctor that suggested hospice care for me. I mean, that's how far things actually were. But it wasn't so much God's grace and mercy as much as it was the big assist from prayers from many of you all in the audience. And one person who deserves, well, there are several people here that, let's see, I'll go with the subplot and then I'll hit the punchline. But there have been a number of people who are here tonight that have helped me get to this point. Reverend Ricky Woods, who from First Baptist West, who's been there from day one. Whenever I'm on the phone with him, Kathy will say to me, "Are you on the phone with Best Man?" So the best man for my wedding, Bill Jones and his wife Willetta, they've been there every step of the way. But I cannot say enough wonderful words about my wife, Kathy, who has been there through every step of the way, every doctor's appointment, every hospital visit. And, you know, talking to Mel Watt over the weekend, we were talking about the role of caregivers. And in many respects, caregivers do not get enough attention. I mean, when you talk about all the hard work that goes into making sure that somebody is able to put one foot in front of the other and get to the next day. And I would also be remiss if I didn't thank my nurse from Atrium who's been there through the dark times and seen a lot of the growth. Dylan Brosted, you're an amazing guy. Dilly is just, Dilly's the man. He's amazing. And since we're applauding, how about a round of applause for my wife, Kathy? I mean, I would not be here without her. Thank you, dear. So enough about me. Let's talk about Julius Chambers for a moment. I'm trying to remember the first time I met Julius and Vivian. I had a head full of hair. And I've known Derek for a long time, watched him go through. I remember when Derek was on the staff of the Mecklenburg County Jail. I wish Fergie was here. I wish James Ferguson was here. He's out of town, unavailable. And then, there's the great work of Geraldine Sumter, and the fact that this particular law firm has endured so many changes, has fought so many battles. And I don't know if you guys got to see the piece that we did last night with Jamie Bowl with WBTV on your side, but Jamie and I are sports fans. And we were talking, and I said, Jamie, and I said this on the air, I said, if Julius Chambers happened to be a baseball pitcher, he probably would have been the guy that won the Cy Young Award, simply because when you look at his record, 8 for 8 in the United States Supreme Court, how amazing is that? That is just one of those things. So, to be proud of. So in any event, when you look at the contributions of Julius Chambers, and you will also hear from former Chief Justice Henry Fry in this piece, and you look at titans of civil rights politics in the state. And I guess to close on before we roll the tape, the one thing I will say about Julius, he never held political office, but in many regards, so much of what he did in our legal system has stood the test of time and continues to impact public policy. So with that, let's just say, roll the videotape.
Support for Julius Chambers, A Life of Service, Courage, and Conviction is made possible by a gift from the Arts and Science Council of Charlotte-Mecklenburg, ASC Culture for All. Additional support also comes from the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture. Located in Center City, the Gantt is a place in Charlotte for unique cultural experiences.
Fighting against discrimination was part of his journey and personal mission.
Minorities were just disadvantaged and didn't have means for challenging those disadvantages.
It was a passion that took on more than one cause.
Julius L. Chambers, civil rights icon, humanitarian, university chancellor.
Finding fairness attracted premeditated violence.
And my car was blown up.
Such a quest for equality empowered the disenfranchised.
Attorney Chambers made it his life's work to serve his community.
Service not only benefiting his clients, but countless individuals.
Doing what he did, he changed the lives of millions of people.
Scoring 8 wins and not a single loss in the U.S. Supreme Court adds validation to his purpose and principles.
He was about public service. He was soft-spoken and had a friendly demeanor, but he understood the claims and the plights of the people who sought his help.
Assistance publicly applauded in the city he proudly called home.
Let's celebrate Julius Chambers and the legacy that he leaves for all of us.
An important face greets visitors coming to the Mecklenburg County Bar Association in Charlotte, and the impact of the cases he was involved in are analyzed in a makeshift courtroom 2 flights up. Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Crump. The name Julius Chambers is synonymous with civil rights here in the Carolinas and across the country. His successes, though, would come with a series of personal challenges. Chambers' life would be threatened and personal property destroyed. Still, he remained undeterred in a quest for equality and justice as well as fairness that went on for decades. This attorney never held political office, but much of his work impacted public policy, as we're about to find out in Julius Chambers, A Life of Service, Courage, and Conviction.
We are racially polarized today. We do that or exhibit that in our voting. And it's crucial in the voting rights area that we continue with plans similar to those involved in these proceedings today to ensure that all people will have an equal chance to elect representatives of choice.
His highly publicized political statements, along with a string of successful legal victories decided by the U.S. Supreme Court during the 20th century, remain well documented. And years after the passing of Julius Chambers, this man's meaningful legacy lives on. Honoring such a bold presence is revered and revived through the naming of buildings, as well as a series of creative works designed to remind us of his reach, image, and likeness. However, comprehending his life means taking a trip down memory lane through the attorney's personal footsteps in his hometown of Mount Gilead, North Carolina.
My father ran a garage and service station, and I worked with him.
Not far from Main Street, a white customer skipped out on Chambers' family business by refusing to pay for vehicle repairs, and that influenced a life-changing decision.
So I went to law school, but things were rigidly segregated in Montgomery County.
Before enrolling in law school, he completed undergraduate studies at Durham's North Carolina Central University. It is the campus where the future civil rights attorney excelled academically by becoming student body president and was applauded for demonstrating leadership in the classroom across the Durham campus. After graduation from North Carolina Central, his next stop was just 11 miles away at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. For the next 3 years, pursuing a law degree and passing the bar put him in a position of breaking new ground.
Well, Julius Chambers probably made better history than I did. You know, he was editor-in-chief of the Law Review.
Former North Carolina Chief Justice Henry Fry and Julius Chambers were among the law school's first African-American students. Fry became an associate editor of the Law Review, who was credited with a number of printed articles, and in 1962, Chambers took on the role of editor-in-chief, the first of his race to oversee the publication before graduating number one in his class.
I started practicing in 1964, and part of the charge was to try to implement the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education across North Carolina. Mm-hmm. And I was working with an NAACP state branch, and Kelly Alexander was then president of State Conference.
Because of their work in the civil rights arena, Kelly Alexander Sr. and Julius Chambers shared a very violent tragedy. They and two other African-American families survived an act of premeditated domestic terrorism during the same evening.
I don't have any knowledge of knowing why this was done, other than who did it. But I do know it was an organized attempt at our lives. No question about this.
Exploding dynamite delivered under the cloak of darkness during 1965 on a November Sunday night also wrecked the homes of Alexander's brother, Fred, who was elected as Charlotte's first African-American city council member, and activist Dr. Reginald Hawkins.
I'm quite sure it's either the Klan or people of the Klan mentality.
No one was injured as a result of the sinister act, but more than a half century later, the attack is still an FBI open case. History clearly and loudly demonstrating the dangers of seeking equality during the 1960s. And in the case of Julius Chambers, it wasn't just his house damaged by a shameful act. His car intentionally targeted and blown up while giving a speech to the NAACP in New Bern, North Carolina. It was done by KKK members, and his Charlotte law office also went up in flames at the hands of arsonists.
That was just one of the problems that we had to deal with or expect because of the work we were doing. There were a lot of people who were very much opposed to efforts to integrate, and they would go to all extremes to show their opposition.
3 Klansmen received suspended sentences and probation for the car bombing, but the damage at his law office, just like the explosion at his home, are both unsolved.
We had federal and state officials who supported what the perpetrators were doing, and they would not seriously investigate and try to identify who did it.
10 years before he started practicing law during 1954, the Supreme Court rendered its landmark decision in the famous Brown versus Board case. In theory, the ruling was designed to end the often unbalanced educational practices of separate but equal. Justices said the decision was to be carried out with all deliberate speed, but many communities moved at their own pace.
They did everything they could do to delay justice in response to the 1954, all with all deliberate speed. And it's been delay, delay, delay. And justice delayed, as you know, is justice denied.
3 years later, schools in Charlotte decided to integrate by admitting 4 African-American students. Dorothy Counts, who attempted to attend Harding High School, a 15-year-old student to take. Her family pulled the plug after unrelenting taunts and threats, as well as violence, during 1957.
It is with compassion for our native land and love for our daughter Dorothy that we withdraw her as a student at Harding High School. As long as we felt that she could be protected from bodily injury and insults within the school walls and upon the school premises, we were willing to grant her desires to study at Harding High School. Contrary to this optimistic view, her experiences at school on Wednesday disillusioned our faith and left us no alternative.
Finding the balance connected to the 3 R's in race, along with school integration, remains an inexact exercise. 13 years after Dorothy Counts exited Harding High School, the concerns over educational desegregation was back on the High Court's docket and fueled one of Charlotte's front burner issues.
We decided to file a lawsuit. And at the time, the law had not developed to the point where we were certain, could be certain, that the court would require integration of the schools as we were trying to establish.
The impact of the Swan versus Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools case developed standards, practices, and policies in places of learning well beyond North Carolina.
We were glad the court proceeded to consider it. But with the Swan decision, we were able to go back and really integrate schools in a number of other places around the country.
His relationship with the Supreme Court didn't end with the Swan decision.
Thurgood Marshall, the first Negro to serve on the United States Supreme Court, puts on his robes with the assistance of his wife. President Johnson named Marshall to replace Justice Tom Clark, who retired. Justice Marshall, the great-grandson of a slave, swore to do equal right to the poor and to the rich as the Supreme Court opened its 178th term.
Without question, Thurgood Marshall emerged as one of the most famous civil rights attorneys of the 20th century. Before being appointed as the nation's first African-American Supreme Court justice, his stellar career would cross paths with Julius Chambers. That happened in 1963, during the same year that gave us the March on Washington. Months after this historic gathering, known for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech, Marshall recruited Chambers to be an intern with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
I started with the schools and saw the differences in the schools, those for Black kids and those for white kids. I saw the resources that were provided at the schools and in the communities, and I saw the limited job opportunities that minorities had or could get, and how the doors were just closed on their efforts to get better jobs and better income.
While he would have a string of successful wins in the Supreme Court, one of his most memorable battles connected to the 9 justices pitted Chambers against a riveting moment of American history.
As a Black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity Blacks who in any way deign to think for themselves, to do for themselves, to have different ideas. And it is a message that unless you kowtow to an old order, this is what will happen to you.
Tension was an obvious subplot during the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings, and at the time, Chambers headed the New York-based NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
We are compelled to oppose Judge Thomas's confirmation because it would further threaten civil rights and constitutional guarantees that are now under siege.
He was the fund's third leader, filling the shoes of famed civil rights attorneys Thurgood Marshall and Jack Greenberg. Chambers headed up the LDF, as it's called, during a 9-year run between 1984 and 1993.
I had an opportunity to work with, but it was more important to me that we provide some assistance for a group that I thought was disadvantaged and foreclosed in connection with their dreams and aspirations. So I passed up the money to think about helping to address a major problem.
Jurists connected to the highest court in the land fully understood the work and reach of Julius L. Chambers. Cases he took on not only resonated in the U.S. Supreme Court, but made it on the radar of the Clinton White House, where his name was connected to a short list of potential federal judges.
And I knew that some of our senators would not approve it. And so it was not only in the Supreme Court, but also in the circuit court and district court.
Surviving congressional scrutiny meant blazing a new trail, something he was familiar with, because early on, Julius Chambers managed to find ways of making history.
We now are reaching a very special moment in history for this organization. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the integration of this organization in 1967. In 1967, two legends of the bar became the first African-American members of the North Carolina Bar Association. Former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Henry Fry and Julius Chambers, whose name just rings of equality and civil rights.
While Chambers and Henry Fry were among the first African-American graduates to complete their law school studies at the University of North Carolina in the 1960s, both men still faced signs of discrimination. Before the turbulent decade ended, the two men joined the North Carolina Bar Association as its first members of color. During 2017, the group acknowledged the 50th anniversary of their membership.
Julius Chambers was probably the smartest person I've ever known. The guy could remember, you could tell him something today and tomorrow, yes, next year, I mean, he would remember it. And he could cite history and cite cases. And I mean, he was a smart fellow. So I tried to learn from him. Now he claims he tried to learn from me, that was his humility. And he was a great guy, made a lot of difference.
The law firm he founded, now known as Ferguson, Chambers, and Sumter, was North Carolina's first integrated office of attorneys.
He was a pioneer. He was fearless. He was really a child of the New South and had helped to make it what it was. I'm just delighted that I knew him.
His accolades are lengthy and confirm a life well lived. Beyond the symbolic signs of celebration, every day, thousands see his name along a very busy stretch of Interstate 85 in North Charlotte. While recognition was delivered on a state level, honors also came from the federal government.
Presenting the Julius L. Chambers Civil Rights Memorial Post Office, Charlotte, North Carolina.
Behind the renaming of the Dorada Station Post Office was North Carolina Congresswoman Alma Adams.
But Julius Chambers persisted, never forgetting that the work that he and his team were doing was for the benefit of those who would come after them.
As a champion of equity and equality in education, the Charlotte-Mecklenburg School Board during 2021 renamed a place of learning in his honor. The script was flipped at one high school that paid tribute to former Confederate General Zebulon Vance. It now goes by the name of Julius L. Chambers High School.
Julius L. Chambers became a champion of civil rights. His tireless work for equality made an impact on everyone's life. I have one favor to ask before I sit down to all the students. Please read up on Julius L. Chambers. Know and become knowledgeable of all of his works and deeds.
His works and deeds are valued at UNC Chapel Hill for bringing something to the law school that remained near and dear to his heart.
I was really pleased at Carolina that the dean of the law school was able to start a Center for Civil Rights.
120 miles from the law school and civil rights center he started is the Carolinas' largest city, Charlotte. And throughout the Piedmont, Julius Chambers remains greatly missed. Such a loss in the local landscape created the need for a lasting reflective remembrance. The undertaking in preserving the memory of a life well lived landed in the hands of sculptor Ed Hamilton. His vision required transforming the personal assets of such a respected man into an embraced artistic work.
So, a very strong, quiet man, a man of dignity, a man of courage, a man who fought for the lowly man. And that's what I've learned about him. And I'm trying to bring him to life in bronze.
Strength and dignity are among his listed qualities in the biography, Julius Chambers, A Life in the Legal Struggle for Civil Rights, which describes the attorney whose vision went beyond social justice and believed progress for African Americans depended as much on economic development as on civil rights.
My task is to not only bring him alive, but to make him feel who he was, the strength in him, to show strength.
Placement of the Chambers statue means he joins former businessman Thad Tate as the second African-American on Charlotte's Trail of History. Back in 2015, Tate was recognized along the Little Sugar Creek Greenway on the Trail of History that pays tribute to significant individuals who have made major contributions to life in the Queen City.
We raise the money for these bigger-than-life bronze statues. We contract with the sculptors, then we install them, and then we gift them to the county.
Created in Hamilton's Louisville, Kentucky studio, the meticulous exhibition from concept to completion lasted more than 3 years. The likeness of the attorney who made a living before the public was shrouded in secrecy.
You will think of him as someone that would quietly advise and guide you no matter what was going on, whether it was legal, whether it was personal, whether it was friendship or family.
On the day of its unveiling, no shortage of admirers, which attracted friends, family members, and former law partners who recalled his simple approach in greeting strangers.
Hello. How you do? What's your name? Where are you from? Who are your people?
While his engaging personality was remembered, the sculptor who reinvented him reflected on the attorney's purpose.
Unionizing people for justice with national policies that included desegregations of schools, righting legal wrongs for individuals in his community, and setting precedents in the legal community and in our world.
1, 2, 3.
Wow.
Take my hand.
The passing of Julius Chambers in August of 2013 created a flurry of headlines across the nation. And on the day many said goodbye, his view, vision, and accomplishments were not taken lightly.
He essentially helped us do the right thing many years ago in this city and desegregate our community and its systems. And he's at the forefront of so much of what's good and right about Charlotte.
Individuals on the front lines of change remain inspired through his ability of challenging society's norms.
We're going to imitate him by continuing to fight for justice, fight for equality, fight for human rights, and fight for voting rights.
Such an impact went beyond politics, and some of the Tar Heel State's best-known elected officials were moved by his wide reach.
It's important to keep moving North Carolina forward, and I think Chancellor Chambers, Attorney Chambers, Advocate Chambers would certainly want us to continue to do that.
Opportunities embraced by law partners he shared his practice with.
Greatest honor we can pay to Chambers is to believe in and live out his commitment to equal justice for all.
Analyzing his life means taking into account simple beginnings from Mount Gilead, North Carolina, living through life-threatening episodes of racist violence, remaining committed to North Carolina Central as well as UNC Chapel Hill, and pursuing fairness for the disenfranchised. Coming to grips with selfless acts makes understanding the closing words of his eulogy expressed by Reverend Clifford Jones of Charlotte's Friendship Missionary Baptist Church easier to understand.
Rest, my brother. Rest, my brother. And then enjoy all of the good things that God has in store for you.
Professionally, it was an amazing and incredible career in bringing about change. Not only was Julius Chambers a successful attorney, but he was also a dedicated and devoted family man, husband to Vivian, father to Derek and Judy. The work that he started in the 1960s remains relevant in the 21st century today and still has a lasting impact. That's Julius Chambers, A Life of Service, Courage, and Conviction. From the Mecklenburg County Bar Association in Charlotte, I'm Steve Crump. Thanks so much for joining us. Now's the time we get to hear from some of the people that you saw on the screen. And I want to bring up Derek Chambers, son of Julius Chambers. And the next person that I want to bring up basically says, what's your name? Who's your people? His former law partner, Geraldine Semper. Geraldine. So in moments like this, I kind of go back to the theme from the movie Love Story, which is, where do we begin? And, you know, the editing process, and I can't thank my editor, Ray Falkenberry, for putting the music and the pictures in the right places and all of that. I mean, you know, he's just a compelling storyteller. But even tonight, even though I've looked at this piece, I don't know how many times, there are always more questions, and I want to take it from two perspectives. One being the legal side of it, and then I guess the family side of it. And on the legal side of it, Geraldine, and we open up with that press conference outside the Supreme Court. We hear a lot about voting rights and the like. Where do you think Julius would be with the Supreme Court, and especially with some of the things that we've seen, coming out of the court, like Shelby versus Holder, which is, a well-known voting rights case that, deals with some of the disenfranchisement that we continue to see at this point?
I think that the chambers that we saw back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would be the same chambers that you would see now. Chambers was never one to rest on his laurels. Even when Chambers was sick after he had the heart attack. So I get the call that he has a heart attack on a Saturday. I go by to see him at the hospital Saturday night, and Chambers is in there watching CNN or MSNBC. And I go back to see him that Sunday, and I, again, find Chambers in there, even with the little medication they'd given him, still watching the news and trying to talk about what's going on. And I said, Chambers, well, let me find you a golf game, and you watch some golf for a little while, right? But every time that I went to see Chambers in the hospital, and I was privileged. I was one of the people allowed to go to see him. He was concerned about what was going on in the news, and I had to have a conversation with Chambers about what was going on in the news. And I remember being in there one time, keeping him company, and he's in here worrying about what's going on in the General Assembly. And at that moment in my life, I could have cared less about what they were doing at the General Assembly, because we knew it was a whole bunch of whatever, nothing had really come. It was the debates and the deliberative process that we were seeing. He was watching one of those live spans kind of things. But Chambers was all in it. And, typical of Chambers, he might doze off a little bit, or I thought Chambers was dozing off. And he'd pick right back up and continue the discussion, as was typical of Chambers. So whatever we saw in Chambers before, we would see that now. He would be incensed, outraged, dismayed, and disappointed at what we are seeing as a tremendous retrenchment in civil rights. You mentioned Shelby versus Holder, which gutted a major part of the Voting Rights Act. So there is a legislative fix to that. You may know it as the John L. Lewis Voting Rights Act, which we are having the hardest time getting through the Congress. Can get it through the House, but we can't get it through the Senate. And all of Chambers's work, all of that constitutional work, was premised on the fact that this nation is a democracy and that the Constitution guaranteed everybody equal rights. I think Chambers paid close attention to issues involving race and discrimination based on race, sex, age, national origin, handicap status as a piece of our domestic policy. But he understood that those rights were rooted in the Constitution and rooted in legislation that was passed as a result of political action. He did not believe that the work that was done in the courtroom was done in a vacuum. Chambers was involved in all of the community activities. He talked to you about his work with NAACP. So it was a collaborative effort across many groups, many movements. And I think he would be doing that now. I think Chambers was always a big picture person. And when I say big picture, I mean he didn't just look at one individual case, but he tried to see where can a case have more impact. And he paid attention to things happening around us that did not necessarily appear to be a, quote, civil rights issue or a black or white or race issue. The fact that Citizens United, which is a Supreme Court case that allowed or rather ruled unconstitutional campaign finance laws.
The open checkbook law.
Yes. Whereas in the past, under those laws, corporations were limited in the amount of money that they could put into political campaigns. The Supreme Court basically said that that was unconstitutional, that a corporation should be considered as a person, and that corporations had rights. Well, we have seen all kinds of money impact political races, which impact how people in legislatures, on city council, school boards, whoever, vote on issues, and how those votes translate into challenges for democracy. Chambers paid attention to what was happening around the world. Like Martin Luther King, he did not see our struggle as purely a domestic struggle. Chambers went to South Africa in the early 80s during apartheid to help Black lawyers there develop an organization called the Black Lawyers Association, and had appended to it a legal education center like we have the LDF.
And as a matter of fact, not just him, but your firm was committed to that because you went over, James Ferguson went over, so it was a commitment. Now, you talk about Julius Chambers in terms of his totality. I mean, here's a guy who wears several different hats. I mean, he's the chancellor of a university, the director of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. You know, he's also, you know, even though we didn't get into it here, getting folk out of jail, dealing with DUIs and speeding tickets and putting food on the table and the like, which brings me to Derek. So we know a lot about your dad's legal accomplishments, but I know you got a good story or two about what was he like sitting around the dinner table or around the Christmas tree? I know you got something you can give up.
Well, my father had a dry sense of humor. A lot of you all, you would see him serious, but if you ever came to a house for any of his cookouts or his gumbo outings that he would do for the law firm, you would see a different side of Julius Chambers. He was one that I laughed a lot. I still laugh to this day at, some of the memories that I reflect back on. My father, very quiet demeanor, but I tell you like this, he knew how to put the backside to my behind too when I acted up.
Before it was called child abuse, right?
Yeah. But I wouldn't be where I am today if it wasn't for my mother and father giving me the discipline that I needed, that I try to instill and pass on to my kids.
Let me throw this out to the both of you from the standpoint of where we saw the hardships, the bombing of the house, the blowing up of the car, the torching of the law firm, and knowing your father over the years and having interviewed him and the like, and some of the conversations that we had, explain to me how he always kept such a cool demeanor and never came off, at least publicly, being bitter. I mean, how did that factor into his DNA?
I would call my father Cool Hand Luke. It was just something that, was just in him. I mean, it's hard to explain, but my dad was, you never saw anything that troubled him. You wouldn't see it. He kept a lot in. I would tell you like this, the only time I saw him really cry was when his father died, and he stepped off to himself to do that. He was a very strong-minded person. As you said in the documentary that, and the mayor said, he was a quiet giant. He was so mentally tough. I mean, I remember when the office was firebombed. I remember when they blew up my grandparents' firebomb my grandparents' shop. And my father, you know, he kept the same demeanor all the time. He knew he was focused on a goal, and he would not stop until he reached that goal. He was the epitome of a man. I mean, he was my hero, and I'll say this till I die. He was my hero, and I'm just blessed.
Geraldine, did you see a lot of that in the practice?
Yeah, of course. And I would say to you that, you know, back when I first started practicing, we would drive all over North Carolina to get to wherever the case was. And quite often when we were going down to the eastern part of North Carolina, we wouldn't just get on 74. He would go down 2724 so he could stop in to see his parents. Mm-hmm. So I got to meet Mr. and Mrs. Chambers, and I saw a lot of Chambers' parents in him. He would kind of go over and sit and talk with his father. Was really quiet, even-keeled person. And Mrs. Chambers was very kind and gracious and had a good sense of humor, and she would always offer you something to drink, and invariably it was a V8 juice, the first thing out of her mouth. Not a Coke, but it was V8 juice. But he always stopped in, and I just think they raised him in that way, and I think his personality, you know, everybody has their own personality, but I think Chambers got satisfaction out of keeping focused. I can't remember this lawyer's name. Vinroot and Mel might remember, but his last name was Hewson, and he used to drive this old big square taxi cab that he whitewashed gray or something. You know what I'm talking about? You people know who I'm talking about. But in any event, there was some honor that the Mecklenburg County Bar was bestowing on Chambers. And the night before, they had a fancy dinner up at the City Club or somewhere. And Mr. Hewson got up and he talked about Chambers. And he described him in this way. He said, you know, sometimes you know you're going to a fight. And you know you got your knives drawn, and you get into the fight and you have a real good fight and you think you have gotten the best of it and that you won that fight. He said, but if you got in a fight with Chambers, you better be careful when it was over not to shake your head. Meaning that he would have gotten you, beat you, and cut you before you even realized it.
Which leads to the next question, perfect segue. And we have a room, you know, filled with a good share of attorneys tonight, which when you look at some of the court decisions that went in his favor, and even though you had, you know, certain judges that may not have agreed with him politically, racially, or philosophically, the thing that keeps coming back in terms of validating his credibility is they said he knew the law meticulously. And when it was on the merits of the law, you were able to distill so much of that, which allowed there to be a number of favorable outcomes.
Well, that's true. But I do want to say, and Chambers would tell you if he were here, he lost a lot of cases too. When he first started practicing, there were decisions that were not favorable. There were ties in the opinions of judges in the Fourth Circuit that rendered many of his cases to be reversed on appeal, that he won here at the district court level, major employment cases. So Chambers had a good record in the Supreme Court, but every lawyer, myself included, Fergie, Mel, Richard Vinroot, all of us sitting in here, will tell you that no lawyer has a perfect record. Now, I got one little caveat to that. I don't practice criminal law, but Mr. Chambers, after he was down there at a chancellor at North Carolina Central, called me up one day and said, Geraldine, you got to go to Montgomery County and represent my aunt and uncle. They've been charged with second-degree trespass. I said, Chambers, you know I don't do criminal. He said, Geraldine, go down there and represent my aunt and uncle. So I went, let me tell you, first of all, it's Mr. Chambers' aunt and uncle. I'm going to Montgomery County. I cannot embarrass them or myself. So the amount of studying that I did for defending a second-degree trespass case was ridiculous. But I went down there, and you know, all criminal defense lawyers know you're supposed to try to get the case dismissed before it even goes to trial. But I was ready. I had my jury sheets, my questionnaire. I'm ready to go. This is in district court. I'm even gonna get a jury. I didn't know that then. But I talked to the DA and I said, look, these are the elements of the second-degree trespass. They are not met. You better not put this case up. Don't do it. Man looked at me, and the person who was bringing the charge or convinced them to start this case, I said, you don't got no evidence of no second-degree trespass. You got to tell Mr. John Miles were their names, I think. What were they? Anyway, you got to tell them that they're trespassing. You got to ask them twice. I said, you didn't even talk to them, did you? No. DA says, we got to dismiss this case. I said, hot dog. I have won my first criminal case. I haven't tried another one since then. Fergie and Chambers and all the rest of them, Henderson, have done death penalty cases, all that stuff. I got them beat. I batting 1,000 there. But Mr. Chambers was very happy. His aunt and uncle were happy. I was good.
Derek, talk to me about generational family values, because when you look at what came out of Mount Gilead, transcending into Mecklenburg County, I think of your Uncle Kenneth being very successful, well-known doctor in this community, your father. What do you think instilled those kinds of, I guess, that sense of determination, the goal seeking, the perseverance, the academic excellence?
My grandmother, my grandfather, they instilled in all of the Chambers kids to go to school. You know, the story about why my father became a lawyer, all of my aunts and uncles were able to go to Laurinburg Institute. My father was the only one who didn't go to Laurinburg.
You went to Peabody.
Went to Peabody, that's right. My father, at a young age, he joined the book club. So he read a lot of books, kept him entertained. But I would say my grandmother, the drive that my grandmother that she saw in both her sons. You know, my uncle, he's done a lot of things, made history here in Charlotte, being the first OBGYN, Black OBGYN. I mean, it's amazing that two young men from, the Clay Hills of Mount Gilead, North Carolina, would make such an impact in Charlotte. It's something. It's an honor.
Your thoughts, Geraldine?
Well, I agree with Derek. I think the Chambers family was molded by Mr. and Mrs. Chambers, definitely. I remember the John S. Leary Bar, which is the local chapter of the North Carolina Association of Black Lawyers, and the Charlotte chapter of the Old North State, which is the African American Medical Dental Association, held a banquet, and they honored both Dr. Chambers and Julius Chambers. And at some point in that function, somebody made a very truthful remark, and that is every single person in that room was there because of those two people opening doors and opening paths for them. And that was a predominantly African-American audience. And I repeated that comment when Mr. Chambers was honored by the Charlotte Post, because I believed, even at that time, in a very integrated audience, that everybody in that room was where they were in part because of work that either Julius Chambers or Kenneth Chambers had done. And, you know, they were very generous people. When, you know, you later told me a story about how Julius Chambers and Vivian Chambers hosted these social gatherings. Any Black professional, a new teacher, a new dentist, doctor, whoever came to town, they embraced them and made sure that everybody else knew who they were. And when I came to Charlotte in the early 80s, they were doing the same thing over there on Donshire.
You know, you talk about the medical society, and it would be one of those things, not as a slight, but one of the movers and shakers of that organization is with us tonight, and that would be Dr. Lester Wallace. And so I'm sure that he has some of the stories about those kinds of social gatherings. So, and then even in as much, you all, used to have some of the coolest Christmas parties. How I got on that list, I don't know.
Well,
I was just a kid reporter,
I will tell you that, that I technically joined the firm on December 31st, 1982. And so I got invited up to the 1982 Christmas party that was at Mel Watt's house. And
party on Poplar Street.
I'm telling you, that party, I was like thinking I was ready to go about 1 or so. But then the party got a second wind. And I think I finally left at about 5 or so, and people were still going then. And after that, it was like, how can you ever live up to that party? That for me, that was the best of them. There may have been others before that one, but that was one good party. And that was typical. I mean, it was the thing about the firm was that they all worked hard. I mean, really, really hard, long hours. People used to say Derek was in the hospital and the plane flew over, and he said, "Oh, that's my daddy up in the plane." But their families sacrificed a lot. All of the spouses. Now, I mean, I say without hesitation, this community does not know the sacrifice that those spouses made. Now, until Leslie Winter and Yvonne Evans came to the firm, those spouses were women who worked as teachers or social workers or what have you. And the contribution that they made, I wouldn't tell you all about it, but I want you to know that what Jim Richardson's wife said once about important men. Yes. The old saying is that behind every great man is a great woman. She said in front of every great man is a great woman. I don't want to say that the spouses were in front of those men, but they were enablers. They made a huge contribution to this struggle, and especially, the ones who were there at the beginning. They all did, because when the lawyers made sacrifices, the spouses made sacrifices too. We had and have a team of support people who worked side by side with the lawyers. When that law firm was bombed, you saw the pictures of 2 support staff members who were there going through papers.
Was that Ella Hand in one of the photos?
No, I think that was Shirley Neesmith and Vicki Reddy.
Right.
But Ella Hand started out with Chambers. Is still with the firm as an office manager.
Let me say something. If there's a wish that I have as a journalist, it is to do a story on Ella Hand. And the reason why I say that is because you all have seen reruns of Perry Mason. Ella Hand is Della Street to Julius Chambers.
Plus.
Yes,
plus,
exactly.
plus.
Exactly. Yeah.
She is a phenomenal woman. When the firm celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2018, Ella Hand had been working for the firm for 4 years before that. Chambers started practicing in 1964, hired Ella in 1964, hired Adam Stein and Jim Ferguson in 1967. In 1968, April 1968, he invited them to form a law firm. And so we celebrated the firm 50th anniversary in 2018. But by that point, Ella had been with the firm for 54 years, right?
Talk about an unsung
Right?
hero.
And so now 58 years. And she still comes to work every day. Ella has had some health challenges over the last nine, almost 10 years. But you didn't know that and would not have known it if I hadn't told you, because her work goes uninterrupted.
How do we measure Chambers' legacy? Part of it's been written, but based on tributes, things being named after him, I guess gyrations that have come as a result of legal opinions. Is that legacy still being defined or redefined in some ways, you think?
Yeah, I think, everything evolves. Everything takes on a new life and a new meaning as time goes by. And so obviously the work that Chambers did, viewed in the 70s in one light, viewed in the 80s and 90s in another, and being revisited now in the 21st century, it will take on a new light. But the challenge isn't always that we keep things the same, but that we stay engaged, that we recognize what the issues are and what the challenges are, and that we stay engaged and we continue the struggle and continue the fight. There's nothing about the civil rights struggle that is static. Nothing. It will always change. It will evolve. Years ago, you never would have thought about whether you would be asking people what their pronoun is. And some of y'all might not know what I'm talking about, but that would not have been a part of our conversation. Years ago, race was just black and white. Now it's how do you self-identify race? What are the components of race? We know, in the Black community, we could know, well, I don't know what he is, but he's something. And what that meant was, I don't know what the mixture is, but I know there's some black in there somewhere. And under most laws, if you had even 1/4 of your heritage was African American, you were considered black.
Well, you can go to the Mississippi rule of 148th.
Right. So, black was supposed to be a bad thing, and you're supposed to be marginalized and try to get yourself out of black. And, I think we are going to see more issues of colorism, simply because people are looking at color, and I think it's such a ridiculous thing. But it's a problem. And I think that people will confront that more. It will not, I think, erase the basic problem of racism, white privilege, and white superiority indoctrination in this country. We see it in so many ways. Black people, even black people, are subjected to the messaging and images in mass media, in social media, that programs us to have suspicions and doubts about our own Black people. It's a problem. If you take the Harvard bias test, and I encourage everybody to do that, you are going to be surprised at how you have been, as a Black person, impacted by these negative social images that are constantly fed at us. I fault the media for trying to sell images of mayhem and criminality that makes people think that every young African American has a criminal tendency.
And I can relate to both sides of it, because there have been many a battle that I have fought and have lost in terms of, wait a minute, so we're leading the 6 o'clock show with brothers in orange, jumpsuits or shackles or whatever. And in that regard, I call it jumpsuit journalism. You know, I mean, for what it is. And in some days I get my way and it's like, well, yeah, I guess you are making some sense, you know, but it comes to exhibiting and exerting that kind of energy,
Right.
more or less to change the narrative and or to alter, you know, the stereotype.
You know, there was a time when some crime might be reported. If you didn't see a picture of a black person, or if they didn't say he was a black person, then you know, okay, the white people did this. They're just not calling. They're not giving us a picture. I'm going to give you an example. Some Mecklenburg County employee stole money from the Christmas tree thing and bought jewelry, you know, did things that people do when they take money for their personal use. The name of the person was not in the paper, and I've watched that story. The Charlotte Observer had to know who it was. The name of the person was not in the paper. The race of the paper was not in person was not in the paper. Neither was there a picture. Now, the slightest thing that a black person would do would have a picture prominently displayed, or they would be identified by race. And that was just problematic to me. It was public monies. It was, you know, monies that people had contributed for children's Christmas presents that were being stolen by a county employee who was given, I want to say, just so much credit, so much leniency, that maybe she deserved that. But if she did, don't other people deserve it as well? I'll never forget young white children, and I knew they were white, engaged in behavior that demonstrated to me that there was some behavioral or mental problem. I don't see those children's pictures in the paper. I don't see their names to let me know what it is, but I see 14, 15-year-old African-American children who do some, I want to call crazy things for purposes of this discussion, but everybody knows who they are. Now, the way those white children were treated was proper. I believe that young people who have those issues need to be nurtured and treated as human beings. And my complaint is that young African-American children aren't given that same deference. Let's nurture them. Let's not send them off and think of them as early criminals, but let's think of them as children who are having adolescent children growing up problems that cause them to do crazy things that, you know, 2 years from now, they will say, what in the world was I thinking? But in any event, I just think that we don't give the same sensitivity and consideration to our young children as we do other people's children. And we've seen that same problem with Latino children as well, and that's wrong.
Which goes back to your argument of how the issue of race is being redefined.
Right.
Want to wrap it up here with one final question to the both of you, which is how do we measure his contributions, and what do you think Julius Chambers will be remembered for? Derek, you want to go first?
I think he will be remembered for his strength, his vision. As Geraldine said earlier, he was a person who didn't look at the small picture. He looked at the big picture. A lot of people don't realize that when he was chancellor at North Carolina Central, he threatened the board of governors if they didn't give Central that money that they deserved. When he put that threat out there and followed up with it, guess what? Central got that money. So if you go to North Carolina Central right now and you see the expansion that is taking place on the campus, you can thank him for that. So the lasting impact, I would say, as long as that statue is downtown, as long as you have a high school, someone will be able to remember and look up and look back upon his life and his works.
You know, Chambers invested time and energy in people. I'm going to give you a little story. When he was the director counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Elaine Jones was his deputy director counsel.
And she's an amazing person.
She is an amazing
and a
person.
force to be reckoned with.
Yes. She arranged for Chambers to go talk to Tom Brokaw. That's a pretty important thing to do. And Chambers recognized and acknowledged that it was important. But some young person, some young woman, had managed to get herself before Chambers to talk about whether she should go to law school and what civil rights was about. Elaine said to me, Geraldine, Julius is in here talking to this child about whether she ought to go to law school and what this is about, and I'm trying to get him to meet Tom Brokaw. I've been setting this up for a long time, and he's still in here talking to this child. I got to get him out of that. I said, Elaine.
And if you knew Elaine.
That is Chambers.
Sure.
I mean, there was never a person that Chambers would meet that he wouldn't know and he wouldn't talk to. So I think when I think about the legacy of Julius Chambers, I'm thinking about people he actually touched. In addition, of course, to all of the work and the impact of the lawsuits and the movements that he was engaged in. But I think Chambers just never lost the ability and the desire to really have a meaningful conversation with people he came in touch with.
And he made you think.
Yes.
Having said that, we're going to be around if you guys have questions. We can do some one-on-ones here. It's been a wonderful evening. And from the Department of Shameless Promotion, what you saw here, I would say, you know, I'm trying to figure out a nice way of telling you when you can watch it on Channel 3, because the first airing will be this coming Sunday morning at 5:30 in the a.m. So the only vernacular, the only comparison I can think of, well, if you were to leave the Excelsior and go to Waffle House and still in your right mind, you can turn on the TV, and rather than seeing Lee Brock, you'll see Julius Chambers.
So Steve, please let me say this. I meant
Please.
this to be the first thing out of my mouth. Thank you so much
Oh,
for a very inspiring and informative piece. I think in 26 minutes, you put a lot together, and you know, all of your pieces I enjoy, but
Well, thank
I
you.
especially am grateful to you for this piece, which I hope not only will be on WBTV, but will be a part
and
of
it's
the
going to be on
library for
Bounce
schools.
Monday at noon.
Right.
So, you know, skip the soap operas, or after The Price is Right, you can go to Bounce, you know. Well, thanks. And the interesting thing, I remember Derek saying to me once or twice, hey man, you got to do something on my dad. You got to do something on my dad, you know. And so with everything that's kind of happened in the last few years, and, you know, and I guess from a filmmaker's perspective, it's one of those things where I once worked for a person that you can give them a mediocre hour, or you can give them a fast-moving half hour and have them wanting more. And I hope that's what we've done here. I mean, I would have loved to have gotten Elaine Jones or Ted Shaw from, you know, Chapel Hill or some of the other people. But then again, there are those of us that remember, and this is the analogy of putting a piece like this together. Back in the days, you know, open up a can of peas and you throw in some tuna, and then you get that stuff known as thickening out, you know. And knowing what is in the vault and the archives, you know, we were able to stitch it together. So again, thank you all for your support in this project. And one other thing, that is, and David Taylor and I were talking the other day, which is, so if you go down Kings Drive, Julius is gone. He has not been kidnapped. They've sent Julius back to my hometown of Louisville, where I will be tomorrow, and I will find out an update just to kind of more or less do some tweaks to the statue. But for those of us that were there back on that blustery day in October, it was a wonderful day. And thank you for your contributions to this particular program.
Well, Ed Hamilton did a wonderful job, and he was very sensitive. I can say this in
Who I've
this
known
room.
since high school, I might
Yeah,
add.
I can say this in this room. You know, there's a statute in Marshall Park of Martin Luther King. When I first came to Charlotte, somebody said, we're going to lay a wreath at the statue of Martin Luther King in Marshall Park. I went all around Marshall Park looking for that statue, passed it and didn't know. So when Mr. Hamilton came to me and said, well, give me some input on this statute, I said, look, first and foremost, that statute had better look like Chambers. And it did. He did a fabulous job with that.
Knowing Ed the way that I do, I would go home and it's like, Steve, look at these shoes. Does these work? He's holding a briefcase. But the amazing thing is, since the statue's been dedicated, coming out of Big's camera some days around lunchtime, the number of people that go by it and that will stop and have their picture taken with that statue, I find that to be just very phenomenal in a lot of ways. Yeah, great. It's been a wonderful evening. Thanks so much. Make sure that that you tune in next week, and we're off to the next adventure, whatever that's going to be.
Thank you.
Thank you.